The year is 1918. The Russian Civil War is raging. The Bolsheviks desperately need grain to feed their army at the front, to feed their workers in the cities. But the peasants won't hand it over. The rubles the state offers are worthless paper now. The war has ground industry to a halt. There's no cloth, no tools to trade for grain. So the Soviet regime decides to change the method. Stop trading. Just take it. For this, they need two things. One is called Prodrazvyorstka, the law on paper, establishing the legality and quotas of grain seizure. The other is called Prada Treaty, the armed men with guns, tasked with turning every word on that paper into an empty barn in a peasant's home. These two things, one is the brain, the other the fist. Neither works without the other. Today, we're taking this machine apart completely to see how it starved to death the very people who grew the nation's food. Let's start with the brain Prodrazvyorstka. This policy was born in 1918, spanned the bloodiest phase of the Civil War, and wasn't abolished until 1921. It was the central pillar of that extreme economic system called war communism. The name is deceptive. Surplus grain. It sounds like they only take the part you can't finish eating. Your own food stays with you. Next year's seeds stay with you. Only the extra goes to the state. That seems almost acceptable. But the actual operation had nothing whatsoever to do with that name. Here's how the machine ran. The state planning apparatus in Moscow would first calculate a total how much the Red Army needs, how much the cities need. Add them together, and you get an astronomical figure. This number wasn't built up from actual harvest reports across the regions. It wasn't calculated bottom up. It was decided top down. It was purely, the front needs this much, so this much is the target. Then this colossal number was sliced like a cake, allocated to the province, the county, the township, the village, and finally right down to every single peasant household. During this allocation process, nobody came to ask how much land you had, whether it had been a drought or a flood year, or how much grain your fields had actually yielded. Even less did anyone care how many mouths you had to feed, how much grain you needed to survive the winter, or how much seed you needed for next spring's planting. The logic of this system was one simple sentence. The state takes its full quota first. Whatever is left, if anything is left, that's yours. And in those years of war and chaos, the harvests were already far from enough. The war had drained the fields of young male labor. Horses and mules had been requisitioned by the army. All the iron was going to guns and shells. Broken tools couldn't be repaired. The grain a field produced was often less than half of a normal year's yield. But the quota the state handed down was calculated as if it were a normal year or even a bumper harvest. What did this mean? The number the state demanded was larger than everything your family could grow in an entire year. Not the surplus, after keeping enough to eat everything, every single grain, and it still wasn't enough. In other words, this law was never designed to leave you a way out. So who enforced it? That's where the fist comes in, the Prada Treaty. The requisition squads weren't ordinary tax collectors or granary clerks, they were armed work detachments. Their members were mostly workers from urban factories and soldiers reassigned from military units. Many had watched their own families starve to death under the Tsar. They carried a bone-deep hatred for grain-hoarding kulaks. They carried rifles and pistols. In their hands was a document stamped with the official seal. Those two things together meant that when they walked into any village, they held nearly unlimited power. Even the local village Soviet cadres didn't dare get in their way. Because obstructing a requisition squad meant protecting kulaks, which meant counter-revolutionary. In 1918, that label was enough to put a bullet in anyone's head. Their working procedure had 3 steps. Step 1, search. Iron rods stabbed into every corner of the barn, piercing through every haystack to check for hidden grain. Floorboards were pried up. Walls were knocked through. The dirt beneath the kitchen stove was dug out. They tore through the earth searching for grain. That's not a metaphor. That's a literal description. Step 2, ignore. They ignored any explanation, any plea. A woman on her knees clutching their legs, crying that this sack of wheat was her children's only food for the entire winter. An old farmer pointing at his empty barn, saying this is everything. The rest has to be seed for next year to their ears. All of this was kulak lies, counter-revolutionaries putting on a show. Step 3, convict. If someone was found to have hidden grain or merely showed a flicker of dissatisfaction on their face, they had the authority to arrest you on the spot. Your charge was scribbled into their field notebook, grain speculator, or, even more simply, enemy of the Soviet state. The outcome of that charge had only 2 forms, a bullet or prison. In those years, prison often meant the same thing as a bullet, just a slower death. So wherever the requisition squads passed through, it was a plague of locusts. Everything edible was loaded onto trucks. Wheat, rye, oats, millet, dried peas, a few potatoes from the bottom of the pickle barrel. Then the trucks drove off, kicking up a cloud of dust. What they left behind was a village stripped of all its food. and peasants who no longer had the strength to cry. Now you see the distinction clearly. Prodrazvyorska was the clauses and sub-clauses written in the documents of the People's Commissariat of Food, it stated. Each province must deliver X thousand tons. The Prototridi were the violence that turned those clauses into reality. They ensured those tons actually moved from peasant sellers onto trucks. The former was the imperial sword, giving the latter a legal cloak for its actions. The latter was the hand that swung it. Without that hand, the imperial sword was just a piece of scrap iron hanging on a wall. Now let's talk about the consequences of this policy. It didn't operate in a vacuum. Several consecutive years of systematic plunder produced a chain reaction that can be traced with precision. First link. The countryside's food reserves were completely drained. Not just one or two families, every village in the entire grain-producing region. Barns were empty. Cellars were empty. Even the emergency grain hidden inside wall cracks had been taken. Second link. In 1920 and 1921, nature did not cooperate. The Volga River Basin, Russia's largest, most fertile grain-producing region, was hit by a severe drought. In a normal year, when one region suffered a disaster, the state would transfer grain from bumper harvest regions to provide relief. But after years of Prodrazvyorska, there were no bumper harvest regions anymore. Everywhere had already been stripped clean. Third link. Famine. From 1921 to 1922, one of the most devastating famines in human history swept across the Volga Basin and the surrounding territories. How many starved to death? Conservative estimates put it at least 5 million. Historians still debate the exact number using different statistical methods, but no serious estimate drops below the millions. In the hardest-hit villages, there were documented cases of cannibalism. Not isolated incidents, not rumors, facts recorded in black and white in the formal reports of international relief organizations that entered the disaster zone. Mothers cooking their own dead children to feed the ones still alive. These peasants, they sowed the fields in spring, weeded under the blazing summer sun, harvested every grain into their barns in autumn. Then winter came, and men with guns took it all away. And then they themselves, right beside their own empty barns, slowly starved to death. But even then, a class that had been drained of its very last grain still had one thing that hadn't been drained: their rage. Fourth link. Nationwide peasant uprisings. From 1920 to 1921, the Russian countryside went up like a wildfire. Hundreds of armed rebellions erupted simultaneously across regions. Tambov province, Western Siberia, the Middle Volga, everywhere. Peasants rose up against the requisition squads with pitchforks, scythes, and hunting rifles. The government sent in the regular army to crush them. Tukhachevsky even used chemical weapons, poison gas against the peasant rebels in Tambov. Peasants were executed in batches. Hostages were publicly shot as warnings. Entire villages were burned to the ground. But of all the uprisings, the most lethal blow came from those who had once been the Bolsheviks' most loyal supporters. March 1921, the Kronstadt naval base on the Baltic Sea. The sailors stationed there during the October Revolution of 1917 had been the Bolsheviks' most fanatical, most reliable shock troops. They had been at the very front of the assault on the Winter Palace. Trotsky himself called them the pride and glory of the revolution. But by 1921, it was these very men who turned their guns around. What were their demands? The core one: abolish Prodrazvyorska, restore peasants' right to control the fruits of their own labor. What was the slogan they shouted? Soviets without communists. The meaning of those words wasn't opposition to Soviets as a form. It meant, we have had enough of communists ruling this country like beasts. Our own families are being starved to death in the countryside by your requisition squads. We can't stay silent anymore. Lenin understood exactly how significant these sailors were. They were the most elite, most loyal segment of his own base. If even they had rebelled, it meant the entire social foundation was collapsing. He did two things, and he did them simultaneously. First thing, in March 1921, at the very moment the Kronstadt rebellion was erupting, he announced the abolition of Prodrazvyorska and its replacement with the new economic policy. The new system was called the tax in kind. Peasants knew a fixed tax amount. After paying it, the remaining grain was theirs to sell, to eat, to trade. This was his concession to the peasants. But he did a second thing at the same time. Second thing, he sent Tukhachevsky with tens of thousands of elite Red Army troops across the still-frozen ice of the Baltic Sea to launch a full-scale assault on the Kronstadt fortress. After brutal, almost indescribably savage back-and-forth fighting, the rebellion was crushed. Thousands of sailors were killed in battle. Of those who survived, hundreds were summarily executed on the spot. The rest were sent to labor camps in the north, where the vast majority of them never came out again. That was the ending. The men who had once been called the pride and glory of the revolution were completely erased from history by the very regime they had once fought for. So, let's string the entire chain together and give a clear summary. Prozrazviorska was an extreme economic policy of the Lenin era, adopted to win the civil war by draining the pond to catch every last fish. Through government-imposed quotas, numbers far exceeding the peasants' actual capacity, it forcibly extracted grain from their hands. The Prototreaty were the armed arm that this policy extended into the countryside. Without them jabbing iron rods into barns and using bullets against resistance, Prozrazviorska would have remained nothing but a piece of waste paper covered in numbers. Together, they caused a humanitarian catastrophe. At least 5 million starved to death. Cases of cannibalism actually occurred in the Volga River basin. Countless villages turned into uninhabited ghost towns. This catastrophe sparked nationwide peasant uprisings and the rebellion of the most loyal Kronstadt sailors. Lenin was forced to abolish the policy, but at the same time, he used the bloodiest means to annihilate everyone who had dared to voice opposition. The heaviest lesson of this history is, when a system is given unconstrained power, when it is permitted to trample the survival rights of every concrete, living human being in the name of an abstract ideal, revolution, victory, the people's interest, it will manufacture hell without any psychological obstacle whatsoever. And the fires of that hell, they never reached the offices where the policy was written. They only burned beside the empty barns of the peasants.